Thank you for your interest in this recording of See How They Run, Campaigning as a Ranked Choice Voting Candidate from the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center's 2019 Symposium. Before we begin, we have a brief message for viewers. We had technical difficulties getting Judge Doug McCullough on the webinar on the day of the panel. We later recorded his presentation and answers to the questions we posed to the panel. That recording has been spliced into his original position on the panel, second, though the recording still reflects some of the technical difficulties we experienced on the day of. We have added Judge McCullough's answers to the questions posed during Q&A at the very end of the video, if you would like to hear his answers to those questions. His answers are also transcribed in the Q&A document posted with this video on YouTube. We apologize for any confusion or choppiness these revisions create in the recording, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you for joining us for the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center's 2019 Symposium, Building a Solid Foundation. The second session, See How They Run, Campaigning as a Ranked Choice Voting Candidate, will begin shortly. My name is Karen Brinson Bell. I am the Deputy Director of the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center, and I will be your moderator for this session. A few housekeeping matters are needed before we get started. Participants have been muted for this webinar to reduce audio interference since we have a large number of attendees. If you have technical issues, please use the question option to send a message to the organizer so we may try to assist. If you have a question or comment regarding the session, please type that message in the question box. Session 2 will be about 45 minutes, followed by a brief question and answer period. Questions we are unable to address during this live session will be answered in a follow-up document, which we will email to attendees and also post with a recording of this session on the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center website within a couple of weeks of this symposium. You'll receive email alerts about this when they are available. For those that are not familiar with the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center, we provide a compilation of best practices and firsthand experiences from jurisdictions that have used this voting method with a focus on election administration, since that is our background. The website, rankedchoicevoting.org, and our other resources have been developed as educational tools for election administrators, policymakers, voters, candidates, and others. The Resource Center continues to evolve, as does Ranked Choice Voting. Both are building a solid foundation, and we hope these resources and sessions help you and others improve our democracy and the conduct of elections. Our panelists for Session 2 either ran as candidates in ranked choice voting races or are experts at training candidates running in RCV elections. We appreciate them sharing their firsthand experience today, though please know that their participation is not an endorsement by the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center, nor do we endorse any candidate. Campaign materials or positions that may be shared during this session are for educational purposes only. And now I'll introduce our panelists in the order they are presenting. Minneapolis City Council member Linea Palmisano was elected in November 2013 and has lived in the 13th Ward of Minneapolis for 15 years. She has a long history of involvement in her community. Before her election to the City Council, she served as board chair of the Linden Hills Neighborhood Council and as an assistant track coach at the Southwest High School. Additionally, she founded Navigate, an immigrant college access program, served as a board member for the Linden Hills Farmers Market, and successfully advocated for multimodal transit improvements in Minneapolis. Her professional experiences include 15 years of private sector experience in roles with IBM Global Services, United Healthcare Group, and assisting a local small business in its first year of establishment in Minneapolis. In 2010, Doug McCullough was elected to the North Carolina Court of Appeals through the first use of ranked choice voting in the United States since the 1930s. He served until his retirement in 2017. Previously, he had served on the North Carolina Court of Appeals from 2001 to 2008. Other professional achievements include service in the U.S. Marine Corps, retiring as a colonel in the Marine Corps Reserves, legislative counsel to New Mexico Senator Harrison Schmitt, counsel to the U.S. Senate, and Assistant U.S. Attorney in the Eastern District of North Carolina. After 35 years working in the State House to advance women's rights, civil rights, services for low-income people, and mental health consumers, Betsy Sweet ran for governor of Maine in the 2018 gubernatorial primary. She came in a very close third in a 7-way ranked choice primary. She made history by co-endorsing one of her opponents, a strategy that attracted national and international attention. She also was a co-author of Maine's groundbreaking Clean Elections Act in 1996 and wrote and passed the first Family Leave Act in the nation. She now owns an advocacy firm and counseling and coaching business. Grace Ramsey is the Director of Outreach at RepresentUs, where she coordinates voter education outreach for state and national reform efforts. Grace began her career as an organizer with Fair Vote Minnesota's 2013 Rank Your Vote campaign, which focused on educating voters, candidates, and the media about ranked choice voting in Minneapolis's 2013 municipal elections. Through her work at Fair Vote Minnesota, Grace honed her passion for voter education and community organizing, leading her to join the Fair Vote team at the national level and now represent us to continue this work on a national scale. Grace has served on ranked choice voting campaigns in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Duluth, Oakland, Santa Clara, Santa Fe, and the statewide measure passed in Maine in 2016. Please welcome this very distinguished panel as they tell us what it's like to run as a candidate in ranked choice voting elections and give tips to run effective campaigns as an RCV candidate. We'll begin with Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to participate, and thank you all for joining to listen. I don't have slides. I'm just here to tell my personal story with ranked choice elections. So as Kristen said, my name is Linea Palmisano, and I'm a city council member here in Minneapolis. I first ran under ranked choice voting in 2013. I came to a municipal election. I'd never seen myself as being particularly political before. I worked in the professional sector for Fortune 100 companies. I spent a lot of my free time as a volunteer in the community in different ways. I also served, and I have to admit, a lot of my fascination with municipal elections and elections in general was in serving as an election judge in different parts of the city, which was a really great experience in Minneapolis. In 2013, I'd say I had a young family. My day job was really important for me to be able to keep financially, albeit you spend a good portion of the year, 10 or so months of it campaigning for an election of this type. But my own experience at that time with ranked choice voting was really limited to a 3-minute video that a nonprofit had developed back when ranked choice voting had been on the ballot to persuade Minneapolis voters as an election initiative. I did vote for it, but this race in 2013 was really the first time that it was going to be used on the audience that I was interested in, because while it was in existence, it didn't mean much, because in the 2 elections that it had played a role in, or the one, all the way up and down the ticket, there were all incumbents or 2-people races. So people didn't really need to know a lot about ranked choice voting for those first races. I wanted to share a little bit about where I live in my constituency. I know there's some people in the Minneapolis metro area on this call, but certainly not everybody. In Minneapolis, there's a governance structure of 13 council members and a mayor. I'm one of 13. I represent Southwest Minneapolis. It's a geographical, each seat is geographical in nature. Each seat represents about 32,000 to 33,000 people. In particular, in Southwest Minneapolis, you need over twice the number of votes to get elected. That's just different from other parts of the city. Voter turnout in general is really, really heavily concentrated in Southwest Minneapolis, in our city. Up ticket in that year, meaning the mayoral race, I guess, would kind of be the top of the ticket in a municipal year election here. My predecessor, so the current city council member, and her main competition both also lived in this district. The two kind of main competitors, as it was seen, were coming from Southwest Minneapolis too. So while I can admit I've been reluctant about ranked choice voting at times, I have to share that ranked choice voting, for me, as I look back, really contributed to my decision to run for office. If for an older system, I think I would have needed to get through a primary, and that would have really turned me off. I don't look like our typical primary voter in 2013. It's fair to say and acknowledge in Minneapolis that we're a one-party city. We're heavily a Democratic city. In fact, currently serving on city council, there's 12 Democrats and 1 Green Party representative. So the primary system, in my opinion, creates a small audience of possibilities. And in my estimation, as being brand new to this world of politics, I felt like it really eliminated somebody more like me. Ranked choice voting has components of it that I think really helped me to navigate myself as a first-time political person. For one, I felt that it's a friendlier race. I grew up around the city of Chicago, and I grew up not necessarily seeing politics as something that was accessible to everyone, or something that wasn't at times hostile. So I think it would have been intimidating. I know it was intimidating. Even getting into it in 2013 was intimidating. Also, my main competition was a peer of mine in the volunteer environment of neighborhood organizations and some of the other community work in Southwest Minneapolis. So I felt there was some awkwardness or difficulty from a relationship perspective. As big as Minneapolis is, it still sometimes operates like a small city. So I felt that ranked choice voting was going to allow me a more collaborative environment, and that it was going to be friendlier with other candidates. So just to kind of give a few bullet points, here's how my campaign went in a way where ranked choice voting, I think, had some kind of impact or extra consideration. The first was an audience and a plan for voter outreach. To me, this was much expanded, and it was less of a hardcore Democratic Party audience, right? You are not just talking to folks who would go to vote in a Democratic primary or who identify very strongly with a party. I learned how to talk to a lot of different people, and I learned that there were more than 2 Republicans in the ward, which I thought there were only 2 Republicans in Southwest Minneapolis, and they both lived on my block. But what I learned was there were 2 Republicans on every block that I walked in the door knocking that I did, and they were on my list because they voted. So even if there was a sign for my competition in the yard or in the window of a home I was going to, I still went and sought out a conversation. I still went to want to hear what they were trying to say to me, and because I needed to ask them for their second vote, and I wanted to persuade them accordingly. We had debates. We had a lot of them. A 2-way race, me and this one other guy for our Democratic Party's endorsement, expanded to a 3-way race. And then by the end of the day, by the end of filing, come August, all the main competitors were Democrats. I do feel like ranked choice voting invited more candidates into the race. So we had, at the end of the day, in 2013, we had a total of 5 candidates for this city council seat. Often in Minneapolis, the primary voters would determine the party nominee in the fall, and then that's it. So the election in November feels like a rubber stamp for the Democrat that won in the primary, right? And this ranked choice voting removes that step, and it broadens the people who are voters. So, if to hammer on that, under the old system, before an average voter is actually even paying attention, it feels like the decision has already been made. Another way that ranked choice voting, I think, played into my race is the existing incumbent, who at that point in time was the mayoral candidate. She felt reluctant to endorse in this race, and that didn't bother me at all. It probably meant a lot less with ranked choice voting, and I think that overall is a really good thing. It's less of a crown your replacement kind of thing as you're leaving office. Another thing that happened is one candidate, my main competitor, or who I thought was my main competitor, went very negative at the end of the campaign. I had less money. I was terrifically underfunded and couldn't respond at that 11th hour with, like this last minute type of negative piece done on me and another woman in the race. But I think it showed the end results that were positive for me. I think that showed that these kinds of tactics in a ranked choice voting election don't work, because they sure didn't help him. At the end of the day, I don't think it won the person who did that negative attack more votes. And I know that's just my feeling because we don't really know. But what voters told me at the door about the election, about ranked choice voting, was really helped by me carrying around a sample ballot. One of the complications of my race was that the higher ticket, the mayoral race, it was going to be the first new mayor in 12 years because the existing mayor was retiring. There were 30 to 35 candidates for mayor, and people felt intimidated by that, but it was easy for me to show them on the ballot just how easy it was to go first choice, second choice, third choice, and really just find the candidate that maybe they had already had in mind or had had a conversation with. It felt less scary, and I felt the most reluctance of ranked choice voting from some of the older voters in my neighborhoods. Also, since it was a close race, and because of the software at the time that has since changed, it also meant that I didn't know until Friday how my Tuesday night race had panned out. So people think that's really scary, but honestly, it was fine. It allowed me to take down my lawn signs and thank my volunteers and just be at peace with the fact that after running a 10-month-long campaign, I could finally rest and be with my family in the evening instead of feeling like I had to go do something, right? So overall, I feel like I'm in a better place taking office because of how my ranked choice voting experience played out. I think I spoke to a lot more people than in a traditional non-ranked choice voting race or a non-ranked choice voting strategy. I spoke to everyone multiple times, right? And I think that in coming into office, I really felt the charge to be more representative of the collective, of all those voices I had talked to, instead of just my own supporters. Because to some extent, I didn't necessarily know who my second choice, people who chose me as their second choice really were. So ranked choice voting in Minneapolis has really increased voter turnout substantially. We went from 20% previously to 42% voter turnout for these municipal races. And I think we have more participation by a diverse electorate, and I think we're in a better place overall. That's all I've got.
Thank you, Council Member. Before we bring on Judge McCullough, I do want to make a distinction. I don't believe I made this clear in my introduction. Judge McCullough was elected to the North Carolina State of Appeals in 2010, which was the first statewide, that's the key word, statewide, I didn't insert that, use of ranked choice voting since the 1930s. So he had to run statewide for a Court of Appeals seat. Could you chime in at this point, Judge?
Hello, I'm Judge Doug McCullough, and I'm pleased to be part of this panel discussing the ranked choice voting program. I'd like to give you a little history of how this voting system was implemented in North Carolina, and then talk a little bit about my race, which shows the practical application of some of the things that the other speakers may have been talking about. Ranked choice voting didn't come to North Carolina with the purest of hearts, because in about 2004, there was a race for the Supreme Court, and a Democratic candidate lost because of other participants, and a Republican won the race on a plurality. So in 2005, I believe it was, the democratically controlled legislature passed ranked choice voting because they believed that their candidate would have won that Supreme Court seat had this system been in place. And there it sat for about 5 years. Once they passed the law, no one actually thought about how to implement it and make it efficient, or how to count the second and third choice votes. And the issue never arose in any election until 2010. And the way it arose in 2010, and in my race, I had been on the Court of Appeals from 2001 to 8, did not win re-election, and returned to private practice. Well, in 2010, one of my colleagues on the court was appointed to the federal bench, and he took his seat in August. And under North Carolina's election laws, that meant it would be on the ballot in November. So we had a very short campaign season, which left little time for personal campaigning. 13 candidates emerged in this. I think there were at least 5 Republicans and 7 Democrats, or 8 Democrats. We began to campaign. Well, we weren't even invited to participate in candidate forums, because most candidate forums allow 2 to 5 minutes for each candidate to give a speech, and with 13 of us, that would have taken up more time than the candidate forums were allotted at most of these organizational meetings where they invite candidates to come and introduce themselves. So you had to come up with a different campaign strategy other than personal campaigning. You certainly can't knock on doors all over the state of North Carolina. What I came up with, and this was a last publicly financed campaign in North Carolina, and only 3 of the 13 even qualified for public financing. The rest of them could not raise enough money to show that they had any support in the community at all, and were just relying on their name and whatever private money they might wish to put forward. But 3 of us did qualify for public financing. My major opponent, who was endorsed by the Democratic Party, and myself, and even though I'm a Republican, the Republican Party did not endorse because other Republicans were in the race. So once I had money and had a budget, I planned to have targeted emails. And back in 2010, this was an idea that was emerging, to have emails targeted to voters in certain zip codes that were more likely to support you and get them enthused about your campaign. So I financed a targeted email campaign with a consultant who kept people advised about me and the campaign. I also had some TV ads which were run on the Time Warner Cable default channel. So each time a cable customer with Time Warner Cable turned on their television, the first station that comes up is Time Warner Cable's own 24-hour news section, and they carry advertising, and I put all of my ads on that because it was a simple TV buy at all the Time Warner Cable channels across the state, which covers most of the major markets. My TV ad showed a picture of me. It showed a sample ballot next to my head, and it showed a book that I had written by the title, and had the voiceover that talked about my background, and drew an arrow to where my name would be in the ballot, because at McCullough, it doesn't matter how you alphabetize the ballot, I was going to be somewhere in the middle. And the final thing I did was I wrote a personalized form letter to all the major public officials at the courthouses around the state of North Carolina, the clerks of court, the magistrates, the sheriffs, the register of deeds, and the district attorneys, along with every county Republican Party chairman, and urged them in all of these to tell their friends, acquaintances, and people who would be interested in this race to vote for me either as your first, your second, or your third choice. And I did the same at Republican women's clubs and men's clubs that I might speak at, the limited number that we had. And also I wrote any major Republican organization that I could get the address for around the state urging the same thing. And my appeal was always the same. Vote for me first, I hope, but if not first, at least second or third. My opponent, major opponent, was endorsed by the Democratic Party and just urged everybody to vote for him as their first choice. From what I understand, his appeal to his folks did not include vote for me your first, your second, or your third. Just vote for me first. As I said, this was the last publicly financed campaign, and toward the end of it, the Democratic Party sent out a postcard, which probably didn't help him much, but it helped me immensely because it listed him on the postcard as one of the Democratic candidates, even though technically we were running nonpartisan at this time in North Carolina. Each party was somewhat involved in the campaigns. This allowed me to have rescue funds, and I got more TV, and I bought more TV time on non-Time Warner cable channels that are around the state, such as in Asheville and near Elizabeth City and the Virginia border in the Northeast, where different cable companies operated. The results of the race were that when they counted the first ballots, I believe I was about 96,000 votes down, approximately. And I certainly didn't think that I had much of a chance. My email consultant, after several days, called me and told me that I would win by between 5,000 and 15,000 votes, given his analysis of the voting patterns in the emailed districts that he had targeted. I thought he was crazy. But when the results came in, by appealing to the second and third down ballot voters, I not only made up the 96,000 vote deficit, I won by approximately 6,500 votes. Gary Bartlett was the director of the Board of Elections at that time and called me with that news, and he could have knocked me over with a feather, but it actually turned out that way. But appealing to everybody to include you in the top three turned out to be the perfect strategy for this type of voting system. And I think that I probably got a lot of Democratic votes just by name recognition and the fact that we were running in a nonpartisan fashion. Some people, particularly independents, are likely to vote for the best person. So I think it does enable one to broaden your message. Unfortunately, in North Carolina, the ranked choice voting was repealed. They felt it was too expensive. There was no software to count. It was all done by hand, and therefore we have gone back to the plurality situation when we have numerous candidates running for an open seat. And so we have gone full circle in North Carolina on the statewide ranked choice voting, but I stand as the only person who has won it, and I think I participated in and won. And I think I won by doing what the backers of ranked choice voting see as one of its major benefits. I broadened my message, and I appealed to your first, second, or third vote. I'd be happy to answer any questions anybody has.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much. And Linea, thank you. That was great to hear. And I just want to thank you for organizing this. I am a huge ranked choice voting devotee and have been since its inception. And, you know, in Maine, we're one of the first states to do statewide, state and federal races via ranked choice voting. I just want to give you a really quick little background about this, which is we ended up with 2 elections in which we had a governor who was elected the first time by less than 35% of the vote because it was a 3-way race, and the second time by less than 50% of the vote. And as a matter of fact, there hadn't been a governor in Maine elected with more than 50% of the election in about 20 years. So in 2016, we passed ranked choice voting statewide by referendum, and we got 52% of the vote, which was the largest majority a referendum had gotten in a long time. And then a lot of people started talking that basically the insiders, the inside Democratic and Republican establishments got nervous because this is not how they were elected. So my experience is that they don't like change that changes the way they got there. So they said, oh, it must be, we think it's against the Constitution. So even though a lot of people said that wasn't true, they asked the Supreme Court of Maine for an opinion, and they held that the general election, it was constitutional for governor and for primaries and federal elections, but not for our general election for governor and state rep, because in our Constitution it says you must be elected by a plurality, not a majority. So anyway, then they passed a bill. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but they passed a bill saying we're going to delay it until 2021, and we're going to repeal it if there hasn't been a constitutional amendment passed by then. Well, all know that's a very high bar. So basically, it was the same as undoing what the voters had just voted on. So we have a provision in Maine's Constitution for a people's veto, and we had to get 80,000 signatures in 88 days in the dead of winter, in the coldest and snowiest 88 days, like in history. It was unbelievable. People were going out on ferries in the middle of blizzards and stuff to get signatures. So we had the unusual situation of our first general election in the governor's primary and the people's veto of the denying ranked choice voting on the same ballot. So they were saying whether or not they wanted it while they were in fact using it. So it was a little bit confusing, but both things went very, very well. And so ultimately, people, then the second time around, we were asked, and 54% of people said, yes, we meant what we said. We really want ranked choice voting. We're serious about it. And then we went on to have the primary, and then our federal elections were also done by ranked choice voting. And some of you may recall, we had a very hot second congressional district race here, and we elected the first member of Congress, U.S. Congress, by ranked choice voting ever, and that's Jared Golden. So it's a very exciting history in Maine. We feel like we're on the cutting edge, and I am a huge ambassador and fan of it for a lot of reasons. And I just want to talk a little bit about what my experience was and what I believe happened. And first of all, I think ranked choice voting, and Linea said this as well, it totally affects who gets in. So I have been an advocate in Maine for 37 years, working on all nonprofit social service issues and environmental issues as an advocate. And so I don't have a traditional background as a politician, although I've been in and around politics my whole life. I haven't ever run for office. And so I think in a traditional gubernatorial primary, I don't think I would have even gotten in. To me, that was joined with our clean elections law, which I helped write back in 1996, which is basically provides for public financing of our candidates. And so between those two things, it allowed a non-traditional candidate like me to actually get in the race, because there was a very long-standing traditional candidate. There were a number of previously elected officials, and those are the people who got in. And so I would have just been, I think, dismissed early on and had a hard time raising money had we not had these two systems. So I think it really affects who can get in and who believes it's possible to get in. And that was really important. So I think it allows someone with new ideas and to sort of break away from what I call the political industrial complex that likes to anoint who the people are going to be who can get in. So that was really huge for me. And then I think the other thing that was really very wonderful for us is that it really empowers voters. I think so many people that we talk to, and we're seeing it now in the presidential primaries, people are cynical and they say, well, I really love so-and-so, and I really believe everything that so-and-so has to say, but I don't think they can be elected. I don't think they're electable. And in a day and age like we are, I think, in now, in which our political situation and our political structures are shifting, I don't think we know what can be elected. So I think the traditional wisdom of follow the polls, follow the money, and that's who's going to get elected. Well, we found out that that's not always the case. And we have some shining examples of that around the country. But ranked choice voting allows people to get in who maybe don't meet that criteria. And then it empowers voters to say, yes, I'm going to give my first choice to Betsy Sweet, who I think is this incredible activist. And, and then even though I don't think she can win, I'm going to say that's the kind of person I want. And then my second vote will be for the more traditional candidate, or vice versa, however that goes. But it really reduced the cynicism of voters. And again, it makes ensured that I, as a candidate, and that we as candidates, there were 7 of us in this gubernatorial primary, that we actually talked to people. And so that was really, that was fabulous. And I think the other thing that it did is it really got, changed the character of the primary. We were able to really talk about issues. I think so often, especially in the press, when it's a two-way race, people talk about the personalities, they talk about the who's up, who's down, who's in, who's out. This way, we were actually really able to focus on issues. And so that was, again, I think people who are getting cynical about politics felt really refreshed and felt like, oh my God, this is really different. And so that was, we got to talk about healthcare. We got to talk about the opioid crisis. We got to talk about some of those issues in pretty much in depth. I think the other thing that happened that was a very interesting thing in our race is that we really became, the 7 of us who were running, especially the 6 of us who were not the sort of anointed person, really became like a team. And so we really worked together. We were all very collegial. We would often carpool we had 57 public forums around the state, and Maine is a huge state. So there's about 7 hours between the north and the south of Maine. But we would carpool together. We would go to debates. We would go out for dinner before or afterwards and really talk about the ideas. And it was much more collegial than competitive. Now we also all had that competitive spin, but it really did do the thing that I think ranked choice voting has the promise of, which is make it much less negative. Because if I want to be your number 2 vote, I can't bash your number 1 vote. At the end, it devolved a little bit into a two-way race, and I'll talk about that. And so there was a little bit of that happened at the end, but I think it was really, really cut down on. So it was a very little negative campaigning. So one of the things that happened was in our race, there were 2 of us that were strong progressives that were looked like we had an opportunity to win. And so we both were good friends. It was Mark Eves, who was the Speaker of the House formerly, and I, who had worked together for years. I actually trained Mark when he came in as a freshman legislator and sort of worked with the Health and Human Services Committee, which is where I spend much of my time. So we had this idea that both of us wanted one of us more than we wanted to be it ourselves. Like if I wasn't going to be the nominee, I really wanted Mark to be the nominee because we share so many values. And he felt the same way about me. So we did a very unique, I think, co-endorsement of each other about progressives. And I don't know if you guys can run, so we did a video that we put out extensively on social media. Can you run that video now?
Hello, I'm Mark Eves.
And I'm Betsy Sweet. And in this upcoming governor's race, we are competitors, but we have been longtime allies.
The good thing is, and the lucky part is, we have ranked choice voting. So you get to vote for all 7 Democratic candidates.
And we believe that the only way the Democrats are going to win in November is if we elect a strong progressive. And you've got 2 of us right here.
That's right. And just today, the Working Families Party endorsed both of us, which we're really proud of.
Yeah, and we also both have the certification of Moms Demand Action for Gun Safety. So it's not just us saying we're progressive, you know us from our work, but there's a lot of other people who recognize it too. And this is our time.
So on June 12th, you can vote for me first and Betsy second,
or me first and him second. And you can be assured that we will have a strong progressive leader and we will all move Maine forward together.
That's right. We got to turn it around. Make sure you vote on June 12th.
Don't forget.
So, yeah. Great. So, and you might also want to just throw up that the flyer that we did, if that's easy. If not, don't worry about it. But nope, the next one. So anyway, so Mark and I, there you go. So we did canvassing together. We got our volunteers together, and we canvassed back and forth, at the doors. And I can tell you that people just thought it was the most refreshing thing. I think both of us picked up a tremendous amount of support. And then at the same time, we had at the top of the ticket, or 2 other candidates who were just going at each other completely, like, really doing the traditional negative stuff. And so I think it was really, really important. We got coverage in The Economist magazine. we got a lot of national coverage. And so anyway, it was a really wonderful, it felt good to us. We felt really good about it. And I think the voters really liked it a lot. So that was a very unique and fun thing. And then the last thing I'll say before I talk a little bit about the challenges was that, so when we entered this race, as I said, I entered as an activist who had not yet held public office. And people said, Betsy, we love you, but you're going to come in seventh or sixth, you're not going to get anywhere. And through ranked choice voting and through being taken seriously because of ranked choice voting, I came in a very close third and almost second. And I think if I had come in second, I would have won, because the guy who came in number two, I think his second choice votes would have gone to me. But it took 4 rounds of ranked choice voting tabulation for the woman who became the gubernatorial nominee and then eventually the governor to actually win. And that shocked everybody in Maine, because people thought that she was just going to walk away with it. So I think it shows the extent of what the voters wanted, but it also really helped inform her for her general election campaign. So I think that she became a stronger candidate. We got more people involved and invested in her, because they said, well, I didn't vote for her first, but she was my second choice, or she was my third choice. So people were more invested in her as we headed into the general election. Then so that was just a really endorsement to me of ranked choice voting. Interestingly, on the Republican side in the primary, they also had ranked choice voting. They also had a number of candidates, and none of them endorsed it. And they went after each other. They had a much lower voter turnout than usual on the Republican side, because I think they did not embrace the concepts behind ranked choice voting. So I think it made me a viable candidate. I think it made all of us better candidates. I think it focused on the issues. I would say the two challenges that we have still for candidates here in Maine, and I think probably everywhere, is learning how to really use ranked. I think Mark Eves and I did a good job of putting that video out and doing the endorsement of 1 and 2. We didn't do it till late in the campaign, and I think upon reflection, we would have done it a little bit earlier, but we were a little nervous about it. We didn't know how it'd be taken. And then I think the biggest challenge we have is the media. The media coverage was awful, this race. They didn't know they had no idea how to take their role seriously as educators and people or educating the public on all of the candidates. So they, in their heads, used what I would call the old political calculus of who they thought were going to be the front runners. And so they picked the top 2 money getters. Basically, it was how they determined it. And that's who they covered. They did not do extensive coverage of, we had debates with all of us in it and stuff like that, but they did not do extensive coverage in the sort of daily news reporting of anybody besides the top 2 candidates. And I have since been in a couple of forums and been on a couple of radio shows with the press in which they have admitted, we actually didn't know how to cover this. I don't think we did a good job. We didn't cover it well. So I would agree with them. So I think we have to do some training and sort of harken back to the press's responsibility of actually letting people know how different this is, but also actually covering all the candidates and the issues. So I think that's some of the challenges that we have still, but I think it really is it was such a fabulous system for us. It gets rid of the spoiler effect. We had a U.S. Senate race here where we have a very popular independent senator who was running against a very conservative Republican, and there were many people who said, "Oh, we shouldn't run a Democrat. We should just let the independent run." But with ranked choice voting, there is no spoiler effect, which is really, really exciting and opens up the field. So I am, as I said, a huge devotee. I think it's an extraordinary opportunity to open up our political system and our democracy in a really significant way. I know it did for me and for the race that I was in, and I think it continues to have really positive ramifications since then. And I know that certainly Jared Golden's race in our 2nd congressional district, I know that he feels that same way, even though he was a very non-supporter of ranked choice voting in the beginning. I think, as Linea said, I think he got more and more comfortable with it, and it certainly landed him in the U.S. Congress. I will say that in that race, there were several court challenges to say that it wasn't valid, and all of them said this is ridiculous. Of course it is valid, and it took until Christmas Eve for his opponent to concede the election. So anyway, but it's a fabulous system. I think it opens everything up, and I was thrilled to be able to run statewide in a ranked choice voting election. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. We will ask if Grace Ramsey will go forward and and do her part at this point.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much, Karen. And thank you to everybody for joining for this conversation. And it is so great to hear from people like Councilmember Palmisano and Betsy talking about their experiences. As somebody who does the voter education in a lot of these scenarios, it's really interesting to hear kind of the other side of these things. So it's been wonderful to listen to, and I'm excited to share. So from my perspective, I've worked with organizations who are leading in voter education in a lot of the cities that are implementing ranked choice voting. And I think those conversations we're having with voters are just as important to have with candidates. And one thing that we've seen is anytime we're changing the way we run our elections, we're likely to run into some anxiety, potentially frustration, and all of those things are understandable. And the way that we think about this is, oftentimes this resistance to a new system or fear of change comes from a lack of confidence in understanding how the process works and how to engage with it. So that makes education essential at all levels. And as someone who focuses on voter education, I view my role as providing those necessary resources to everyone who's going to be talking to voters, ensuring that they, candidates and their teams and everyone involved in the process understand how this works, and we're giving the best information possible to people. So candidates are essential in that process. And so, we've been training candidates for some time. I think we're getting better and better at this as more jurisdictions are thinking about this. And I want to cover a few of the key things that we want to make sure candidates know when they're planning their campaign, when they're running their campaign, and kind of how the system works. So for us, we always start from the voter's perspective. I think it's important, because candidates are also voters themselves. It's important to start from the beginning and make sure that candidates and their teams understand the process and have the space to ask any and every question that they have. So anytime I'm talking to candidates, I really want to make sure that we have the time. No question is too small. There's nothing silly. We really want to make sure that the best information is being given possible. And also, oftentimes, a lack of understanding in the system can result in poor campaign strategies. If you're not very clear on the system that you're using, it's easy to make mistakes that could hurt you in the long run. And we want to make sure that everybody's on an even playing field, because that's one of the goals that voters have when they pass referendums on issues like this, is evening the playing field. So we want to make sure that the resources we're providing are doing that as well. Understanding how voters engage with their ballot is the foundation for building your campaign strategy. So that's another reason we just really start with the process itself. From there, typically what we want to do is we want to show and explain real world election results with ranked choice voting. I think for a lot of candidates, that can be kind of your aha moment of seeing how in an initial count, the first round, if there isn't that majority, seeing how voters engage with that ballot and seeing how candidates may have constructed strategies to build out their base and build a winning coalition to get to 50%. From there, the key is showing the ways that a ranked choice voting election is different from kind of a traditional election that candidates may have run in before. This can be particularly important for incumbent candidates because they have won a particular way and now may be using a different method to be elected. So you want to make sure that they have a very clear understanding of how they need to shift what they were doing to adjust to this new strategy. So we do that by walking through how to calculate your win number. In past elections, it may have been, you needed it, there were this many candidates running and you knew you needed a certain percentage to be elected. With this, you need 50% plus one. And we encourage candidates to factor in a 2 to 5% cushion as you would normally with any other campaign strategy. So we would walk them through a scenario. We were talking through a scenario where a city is expecting 40% turnout, and that means 25 let's see, 25,600 voters. I believe the city we're using in this case is Las Cruces, New Mexico, who's about to be implementing ranked choice voting for the first time. So when we think about something like that, we encourage candidates to think about what can affect turnout and what can affect that number of voters coming out. So what is below you or above you on the ballot? Are people motivated by that? Are things particularly polarizing? Are there heavy efforts to register voters? Are there going to be a lot of absentee ballot campaigns? Obviously current events, the campaign season, all those things can affect that, but we want candidates to be thinking about that and thinking about how ranked choice voting can impact those things. Then we want to calculate our win number. So if we know we have 25,600 voters, we divide that by 2 and add 1 vote. So that is 12,801 votes plus a 2 to 4% cushion. So we're shooting for 52%. And so your working win number is 13,312. So we would walk through with candidates, and depending on the situation, you may not want all candidates in the same room. Sometimes building those strategies, you want kind of that privacy, but we want to make sure that we are offering it to every campaign at all times, and their engagement is really important. But we've always wanted to be accommodating to the ways that campaigns want to be trained, because sometimes you don't want to learn about these things in a room full of potential competitors. So once we figured out a win number, we really want to go into how building your base of support changes in a ranked choice voting election. And a lot of that takes on kind of a compare and contrast tone. In a traditional campaign mindset, I'm sure many of you have engaged with something like this, but it is a rather us versus them mindset that you're engaging with. You have to determine who's with you, why they're with you, who's not with you, and then really focusing on undecided voters has been kind of the typical approach to this. So the way I've thought about it, or the way I've seen it visualized in the past, is thinking of it like a Venn diagram, where one of the circles is who's with you and who supports you, the other is who doesn't, and where those circles overlap are the voters who are persuadable and who you really need to get into your camp. Now with ranked choice voting, this changes, obviously, because you're not just mobilizing a certain group of people, you have to build to a majority. So the way we think about that is concentric circles. So people you think will rank you as a first choice, and then building out from there to build that coalition to 50%. And we talk about the ways that candidates do this. So that first circle in the center there, the really kind of core of your campaign, is your personal base and your base communities. So your personal base are the folks that you can absolutely count on. You know, they're going to be the people who fundraise for you. They're going to be the people who volunteer for you. And some of them might not even be in politics. You just know that they support you. So people like your family, your friends, coworkers, neighbors, faith community, civic organizations that you're a part of. That's really that base that we talk about. And that's kind of the core of your campaign. And from there, we encourage folks to think about what their base communities are. And that's the other part of kind of your solid core of support. So your base communities are groups of people, either due to geography, age, ethnicity, issues, interests, whatever it may be, are likely going to support you. And whether that means you're involved or whether you mean you're very likely potentially to get an endorsement or something like that, it's who you would think of first to build out your campaign. So those are kind of the essential parts, is building that base of support that you know are your first choice people. You know that they're going to rank you first. You know that you're on that ballot. That's pretty standard for any campaign training. That's pretty standard for any candidate to think about. But where we really make people go a lot further and do a lot more thinking is thinking about building beyond your base. Thinking of how you're going to build that coalition to get above 50% and get that support that's necessary. And there's a few things that we encourage candidates to think about in doing that. So one, power mapping the ranked choice voting process. Thinking through, who do we think is going to be a really strong candidate? Who do we think may be a weaker candidate? Do we have an idea of when folks may be eliminated in the voting process if no one gets a majority? What communities are in my first choice coalition? Who do I have right now? Who do I need to go out and talk to? What conversations do I need to have? And then what communities and who can I tap into to be those second or third choice voters? Who is supporting another candidate where there may be a lot of issue overlap? What are the issues that I want to try to bring people in on, even though I know that they may not support me as their first choice? Then we encourage folks to do a lot of research in the field or of their field. And in a lot of other elections, this means opposition research. And that's not necessarily what we're encouraging people to do because you're not necessarily in opposition to a lot of your candidates, right? So thinking about research on what issues are going to be the focus of this campaign. Where do candidates stand on these issues that are going to be the focus? Where do I stand? How does that differ from other candidates? Where do we align as a field of candidates on issues, and where do we differ? And where do I think that I can build the strongest support on the issues that are going to be the focus? And how much strength do each of those candidates have? So from there, we talk about how you're going to have conversations with voters. That's the real building block of your campaigns, right? How are you going to persuade people to vote for you? And this is another place where it differs from a traditional campaign. So having worked on candidate campaigns where ranked choice voting wasn't used, when you're talking about a conversation with a voter, when you're kind of getting that contact, that ID, it's usually a scale of 1 to 5. 1 being a strong supporter, 2 being a weak supporter, 3 being undecided, 4 being a weak opposition, and 5 being strong opposition. And in those, you know, a strong supporter, you really want to encourage them to get involved with the campaign. Weak supporter, you want to persuade them to get to strong support. 3 is an undecided, you want to have that persuasion conversation. And then for any of those oppositions, unless you see a chance to get somebody on board, you typically don't contact them again. Or if you know they're supporting somebody else, you typically take them off of your list. With ranked choice voting, that changes, right? So you can still have that scale of 1 to 5, but the conversations that you're having at those varying levels change dramatically, right? So with a strong supporter, it's basically the same. You want to bring them on board with your campaign. You want to encourage them to volunteer and get them as involved as possible. With a weak supporter, you want to make sure that you're that first choice. You want to make your first choice pitch, and you want to try and persuade them to strong. And in 3 and 4 are really where these key changes are. For an undecided voter, if they're leaning towards another candidate, 1, you can make your first choice pitch still. This isn't a voter who's off the table. But if they're leaning towards another candidate, you get to ask to be their second choice there, and that's pretty essential. And the same goes for a 4, where they're weak opposition. It's finding the issues that these voters care about and finding what your messaging is on that issue, because you've done that research and you understand where everything falls within the field. Now, if someone's strongly opposed to a candidate, I'm not very much in the business of recommending you continue having that conversation all the time. If someone doesn't like you as a candidate, there's not much you can do all the time, but there's a lot more wiggle room in terms of the conversations you can have. You're not hanging up the phone as soon as you hear a voter supports another candidate. You're thinking about what issues you have in common with that candidate, what policies that you may have some overlap, and why that voter may want to consider you if that candidate doesn't have enough strength to be elected. This is a small change, but it's super impactful because it leaves voters on the table, whereas most of the time, if you see another yard sign, you keep walking. And that's been a really, it can be a difficult shift for candidates occasionally because you're very used to one way of doing things, and sometimes it feels like someone who's not actively supporting you is always opposing you. And we've really had to shift that mindset of thinking these are just conversations with voters, and they don't end the moment that somebody says that they may like someone else. In these trainings, we also really want to teach people and let them practice how to ask for second and third choices. It's become a lot more natural for a lot of folks in ranked choice voting communities, but I can assure you it is strange to do the first time that you do it. To acknowledge that somebody prefers someone else and then to practice asking for that second choice support is something that we would really encourage candidates to do privately first before they do it publicly, just to get comfortable with how you want to approach that. And what we encourage them to do is think about this in kind of your classic messaging box framing. So what do we say about ourselves? What are we saying about the campaign we're running? If we're talking to a supporter of another candidate, what do they say about themselves? What is the campaign that they're running? What are their core issues and focus? And then what do we say about them? What's the common ground we have with this other candidate? What are the differences? Because there are going to be differences. And then what do they say about us? How are they communicating about our campaign? Do we view ourselves as allies? Like Betsy said, as a lot of those campaigns were working together and even carpooling, which I didn't know about and is amazing. But how are we engaging with one another as campaigns? And then the final thing we talk about is how strategy and civility are something that can go together in a lot of these situations, but it can be something that's very difficult. And to be very clear, this is what we advise. We can never control how candidates behave, but we can inform them on strategies that have worked and strategies that have not worked for candidates in ranked choice voting elections. And a key phrase that we always want to share with people is distinguish yourself, don't disparage. And that's something that we found to be successful. I actually remember being in Minneapolis in 2013 with the situation that Councilmember Palmisano described. And I remember feeling a shift in that entire race when one of the people in her field went really negative. And I mean, as we saw, I don't think that's necessarily why she won. She ran a fantastic campaign, but it was something that changed that dynamic and changed how people viewed the race itself. And it didn't work. It was not an effective strategy. And there are a few other examples that we can cite where someone changed that strategy to go after the character of a candidate or to go after somebody really hard rather than focusing on those issues. It is not something that's been an effective tactic in the past. But to be clear, we can't pretend that we all think the same. There are different reasons that candidates run, and there are concrete differences in campaigns and the policies that candidates are running on. So with ranked choice voting, it's about making your case to your potential constituents rather than convincing them not to elect your opponent. This is an election based on addition rather than subtraction, and I think that can be a really difficult shift at times. So what we recommend is you can find those points of agreement and disagreement, and it's essential to define yourself within that. But you need to highlight differences in those policy platforms rather than going after someone's character. We found that voters, while we're forced to engage with it so much at various levels of elections, voters don't like it when they have the option of issue-focused campaign. So that's generally where I'll leave it, and the main things that we try to get candidates to really sort through and think about when they're planning those campaigns. And I'm always open to questions, and thanks so much for the time.
Thank you, Grace. So we will unmute our three other panelists and go straight into our question and answer session at this point. Let me unmute one other. Sorry that we're having these difficulties, but thank you, Grace, Betsy, and Linea for being a part of our sessions and the information that you've provided already. We do have a few questions and even a shout out to Betsy from Liz Smith. She says, hello, Betsy, you ran a awesome campaign in Maine. So you have fans out there.
That's good.
In terms of questions, I'm going to put one forward that really would be for any of the three of you to answer.
We got Judge on. Hello?
Okay. Ladies, if you'll just bear with us, we'll try to finish up his part and then have everyone in on the panel. I'll mute you again and let the judge pick up. Judge? We're good to go. We think. Judge, can you hear us? Okay. Gary, I think the best plan is probably going to be to record the judge and add it into our session later. So I'm going to mute you and then bring our other panelists back on for the Q&A. Okay, we'll go back to Q&A again. This feels a lot like election administration. You plan for the best and go into crisis management when you need to. So let me go to the question now. So for any of the three of you, do you think an incumbent candidate should campaign differently in an RCV contest?
Well, this is Betsy. Well, I think they have to be, I think they have to pay more attention. You know, I think that the idea that the incumbent has a huge advantage shifts a little in a ranked choice voting election. So I think, you know, I mean, I think Linea said it earlier, you know, one of the things that changes with the ranked choice voting is because you're appealing to people's second and third votes, you have to talk to everybody. You can't just say, oh, well, I don't have to, you know, I don't have to worry about them. They're never going to vote for me. Well, they might. And so I think it really does change. And I think that's a fabulous thing. So I think they need to be more talking to voters. I think they have to be more targeting more voters. But I definitely think it's a really important thing I think it makes incumbency a little bit less of an advantage. And that I think should change, is going to have to change how they do things.
Grace or
Yeah, this is Grace. What I would say with that, and I think that's a great point, Betsy, I think, yes, for the most part, but there is something to consider, and that is if somebody believes that they can win outright with a majority, that may change the way you're thinking about this. If you have built a base where you firmly believe you have a majority, then that strategy may stay the same. But largely, in a competitive election with ranked choice voting, you're going to need to have a strategy. So we would always recommend that. I think the more support you can build within your community, the stronger legislator you will likely be. So we would encourage that. But if there is a situation where a candidate is polling and is looking at their polling and has run a campaign where they believe they have 60% of the vote, you may stick with the strategy that has you there. But we would always recommend thinking about where you're going to build that coalition of support.
And council member, do you want to add to that, or?
I'm not sure how many questions you have, so I'll just be really brief. Not in my personal experience, but 2 years ago, I saw some of my colleagues, incumbents, getting more than one challenger against them who had been partnering up with other challengers, right? Well, me or her, but anybody but, the incumbent. And I think that from that perspective, an incumbent's strategy as a candidate is that they really need to pay attention to the topics that those challengers are focused on, right? That they're perhaps looking to take a change of direction in or unhappy with, and they really have to focus on them. In seeing how this election played out for my colleagues a couple years ago, as incumbents losing to people in a ranked choice voting strategy, it was perhaps that they didn't. They wanted to perhaps avoid those topics a little bit more instead of zeroing in on them and showing their work, showing what they had done on the things that the other new people were championing.
Okay. Very good insight from all three of you. I'd like to ask one more question, but I would encourage our attendees, if you have questions you'd like for us to consider either right now during the live session or as follow-up, if you would send those to us through the question box. If you type those into the question box, then if we can't get to them right now, we certainly will try to answer them later, but want to give everyone that opportunity. So here's the next question. As you campaigned, did you find yourself explaining how ranked choice voting worked, or were voters already aware? And you may have touched on it a little bit, but I wanted to kind of zero in on that since that's come up during some different sessions that we've done across the country.
This is Betsy again. I think that there was this pattern that it was going to be really confusing and really hard. And all the voters we talked to said, this is really easy. Like, if you've ever taken a standardized test, if you've ever ordered food off of a Chinese food menu, if you've ever, this is pretty easy. I'd like this, and if I can't have this, I want this. For us, the confusion was that they were also voting on whether or not they wanted to keep ranked choice voting as they were using it. So that was more of a confusion. But I think there's a little bit of a myth around there that this is hard, that people will never understand it. And I think it's used by the opponents of ranked choice voting to say how hard it's going to be. That certainly was not our experience. And there were almost no ballots that were thrown out because they were improperly filled out, or too many people were voted for, or not enough, or whatever. So I think that's a, I don't know. I think it's a red herring.
Mm-hmm. This is Linea. I'll jump in just to say, I can't tell you how much faster those conversations went person to person when I had a sample ballot right there in front of me. Things got so much less scary, and I only have one person in mind. They have a personal relationship to a person that they want to vote for mayor, let's just say, and they may not exercise all of their options, but they just wanted to know how to vote on a ranked choice ballot the way they wanted to vote. And that was so easy to explain to them that I think they then started, and who knows if they did or not, but they really started seeing, maybe I should start looking at who my second choice would be. So I'd say the value of the sample ballot can't be understated.
That's a great point. I'll also just give a little plug. Betsy alluded to this to where it's very pertinent with our RCV Clips monthly podcast. We just released on Friday this month's podcast, which was a firsthand conversation with two voters from Maine who had no experience. They had not been part of any of the campaigns. They just were your everyday voter, and we just found it was really interesting. And Betsy, like you pointed out, it just was an everyday type decision making process for them, and one even said she didn't have time to learn much beforehand going in to vote, and she still found it simple. And then Linea, to your point, they both referenced sample ballots as just being very helpful in their decision making process, and taking away some of the anxiety that anyone had tried to put in their head about the process. So I think both very good points. Grace, I don't want to keep you out of it. You weren't campaigning as a candidate, but you certainly helped with it. Do you want to add anything about explaining it to voters as campaigning is going on?
I don't think so, but I do agree that the sample ballot is pretty essential, and we've seen that candidates who put those on their ballots, it's a very easy conversation and very quick, but we do rely on them to provide some of that voter education. In many places, they've done just a phenomenal job, including the two candidates we have on the phone.
Right. Do y'all have time for just one more question?
Sure.
I hate to put you on the spot, but it's one from an election administrator in Missouri. And I think while I have you live, it would be great to have you feed off of each other on this. For candidates that have run in an RCV setting, so Betsy and Linea, were you educated on RCV as a candidate? Did you receive any kind of education? She's concerned that misinformation put out by a candidate that might not understand it themselves.
I can go first because my answer is pretty quick. This is Linea for Minneapolis City Council. No, I was very new to this, and truly all I knew about ranked choice voting was a 3-minute video. My campaign manager that I had hired did not come from a ranked choice voting scenario. It was the first time he was going to work in a ranked choice voting format. We did have the benefit of a local nonprofit to help us, right? But it was more of just, like a 1-page resource sheet kind of thing. It didn't go into the nuances, but it was pretty easy to figure out for somebody versed in campaign strategy, how you would approach this differently than others. So
yeah, and in Maine, we did. Our ranked choice voting organization here in Maine did do offered training to campaigns, to campaign managers, to candidates, and so that was available. I had been involved in the ranked choice voting stuff since the beginning, so I didn't feel like I needed too much of it, but I sent my campaign manager and a couple of field staff in, and it was really helpful. It was helpful to think about it, because I think it challenged us and provided assistance for us in taking it seriously and figuring out how we might want to change and go after those second and third place votes, and how do you talk to somebody about, great, I'm not your first choice, but can I be your second? And that was and getting comfortable with that, and then actually trying to not just do that on the fly, but have some strategy to that, to figure out whose votes you're going to go after, and who are you most likely to get their second votes, and who's most likely to drop out, and all that kind of stuff. So it's a little bit different calculus, but yeah, we did get some training. I think we could do more, and I think most importantly, the training that we need to have happen is to have candidates embrace ranked choice voting assertively, effectively, like not just say, oh, well, here it is, I'm going to do the same thing and hope it works out, but to really actually say, no, there's things you can do differently. And I think the co-endorsement thing is one way. I think there are a bunch of other ways as well.
Did either of you find yourselves being asked sort of technical type questions of, is it more beneficial for me to mark you as all of my rankings, or what happens if I do that? Anything like that?
Everybody wants to bullet vote. They're like, oh, I'm just going to bullet vote for you. I'm only voting for you. And I would say, that's great, but it doesn't help me. and it doesn't help you. Like there's no benefit. I mean, that's a big misunderstanding. There is no benefit in ranked choice voting to bullet voting for someone. And so that's a big change. I think that is a bit of a sea change for people in thinking, so I did get that. And then the other big question that we got with 7 of us in the race was, are we, do I have to vote for everybody? Because they only have 4 people I want to vote for, and is my ballot going to be thrown out if I only vote for, and so we had to had to explain that. But anyway.
Same kinds of questions for me. One added complication was that on the park board part of our municipal ballot, there are at-large members running, right? And then also district-specific people running. So there was a bit more confusion on how that works from a ranked choice perspective. But same questions that she just said, and same answers really, that no, voting for me first, second, and third isn't going to help or doesn't make a difference. So it was really more of an opportunity, but it was a short conversation.
Mm-hmm. Was Gary, were you wanting to chime in? Or if not, I'm
I
going to sign
just
off.
wanted to give everyone an update that Judge McCullough has agreed to do a recording for us tomorrow morning. So
Fantastic.
it'll be for everybody.
Great. We will definitely make that available. And to our panelists that we did not have technical issues, there's always going to be one session, inevitably, it seems like, where we'll have technical problems. But Betsy, Linea, Grace, we just greatly appreciate your participation. For our attendees, thank you for hanging with us, and we will get the question and answer document out to you and copies of this recording out through email and on our website, rankedchoicevoting.org. Please, for those who have not registered thus far and would like to, please join us at 3 p.m. Eastern Time for our next session, which is ranked choice voting in the legislative process. And then we have another very distinguished panel scheduled to join us for that. Until then, on behalf of my colleagues at the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center, this is Karen Brinson Bell. Have a great afternoon until our next session.
Thanks,
Thank
Karen.
you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Do you think an incumbent candidate should campaign differently in an RCV contest? Even though your race didn't have any incumbents, there's often discussion about whether there's an incumbency favor, and do you think that factors into RCV contests based on your experience?
I think an incumbent would probably be inclined to campaign differently because they've been holding that office for so long, and they would want to, particularly in our cases as judges, we hold this seat for 8 years. By the time we come up for re-election, the state has invested a considerable amount in our training, and we have quite a judicial record, and hopefully one you can be proud of. So I think an incumbent would probably campaign a little different. Now, I don't know that on the city council or even a congressional race, if you were just a one-term incumbent and only been in for 2 years or something, that it would make that much of a difference.
As you campaigned, did you find yourself explaining how RCV, or in North Carolina's case, IRV, would work, or were voters already aware? Do you recall?
As I said, we have very little time for personal campaigning, so we didn't have a lot of personal interface with voters to do that kind of educational thing. But certainly in the letters that I wrote to the officials that I described that, and in my TV ads we described it, and in our good emails we were conducting an educational campaign along with talking about the positive factors about my candidacy. So I think that you have to do a little bit of that educational process as part of your campaign. Otherwise, voters would be confused.
Along those same lines, I did a follow-up question about, and I think it's interesting because you did point out that Thigpen did the sort of the bullet voting, just vote for me kind of campaigning. Did you find yourself having to explain to voters why there was a benefit to ranking versus did some say is it better for me just to mark you as my first choice the whole or for all my choices? Did you have to explain that?
I explained that if I am your first choice, you don't need to vote for others if you don't want to. But I certainly want to be. If I'm not your first choice, I certainly want you to make me your second or third. And
Okay.
so I was stressing, and to some people who were really strong supporters, and if I had an opportunity to talk to them, I would tell them, well, just vote for me if you're really sold on me. You don't have to do anything else. But if in the general broad appeal where I don't know, I'm casting out seed, but I don't know whether that plant's gonna grow or not. I was educating the person to vote for me as first, second, or third, because I don't know who their first choice will be for sure. I'm sending out those letters and in the TV ads, we didn't know, and we wouldn't know in the emails. So either as to whether or not they're going to vote for me first or not. So we were asking consistently across the board in our general communication with the voting population, to vote for me first, second, or third.
And then we had a question from it's actually someone with the election commission in Missouri, or a local election level commission. And what they were wanting to know is, did you have any education? How were you educated, or what kind of education did you have before you campaign? How did you come to understand how ranked choice voting would work? She even noted that her concern is that if candidates aren't educated, would they put out misinformation while they were campaigning?
I think we learned about it from guidance that the Board of Elections, the North Carolina State Board of Elections, put out to explain that, and not only in press releases, but on documents that they had posted on their website, saying what is ranked choice voting and how it worked and everything like that. And then after we understood how it worked, my consultants and I got together, people who were doing the TV, the people who were doing the emails, and we made sure that we understood it thoroughly, and then made sure that we incorporated the message into the campaign literature that we were going to put out, whether it was by email or by television ad.
You mentioned that the repeal it was part of a whole big sweeping change of laws, obviously, we know, but you mentioned that there was a perception that it was expensive. And we actually get recognition because of how little we spend on it compared to what it would have cost to have a statewide primary. Do you know where that perception comes from, or do you, or
I think it was just a perception that some of the legislators had, that if the elections board had to close up shop basically for a week, that it must have been an extra expense and a burden on the system. And that was just one of the terms that they used when they were describing why we need to repeal this. And that if they were going to do it some other way, they're going to have to develop software, and that means they're going to have to spend money to pay their firm, whoever does their electronics balloting counting firm, to develop that kind of software, and they didn't want to spend the money.